I didn't have to go yesterday. Please.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Doug Doach. I'm a partner at the international law firm of Mayer Brown, and it's my special honor to have been a long-term board member of the Chicago Council. Thank you all for joining us here on this cold evening in Chicago. This evening's discussion is critically important for our understanding of the world, especially at a time of growing polarization and division. We are currently experiencing more conflicts at a single time than at any other point in about 80 years. While some are tentatively moving towards reconciliation and resolution, others appear to have no end in sight. Around the world, we are feeling the destruction wrought by these events, and we're witnessing devastating humanitarian consequences. The question becomes then, how can we prevent further harm from these conflicts, and who will step in to broker peace? Initiating peacemaking is daunting. Making lasting peace seems nigh unto impossible. Yet, as the International Crisis Group has pointed out, just as war is man-made, peacemaking is man-made. Each year, the International Crisis Group identifies the 10 conflicts most likely to shape the year ahead, crises that demand attention before they spiral further. For 2026, and we'll hear some of this from our guest tonight, the list includes Venezuela, no surprise, Sudan, Ukraine, Syria, Gaza, Iran, Myanmar, and others. What forces, local, regional, and global, will shape their trajectories? Our speaker this evening is Dr. Comfort Ero, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group, and she can help us begin to unpack these questions. Please join me in welcoming Comfort Ero and our moderator this evening, Leslie Vinjamuri, who is the President and CEO of the Chicago Council.
Good evening. It's wonderful to see everybody. This is a very special evening for many reasons. One is that Dr. Comfort Ero is a very good friend of mine. And so it's the first time I've seen you in Chicago.
Yes.
Which is wonderful. We had a wonderful lunch with Catherine Tai, who was the U.S. trade representative in the last administration, with Ambassador Julian Ventura, who I think is here, our distinguished non-resident fellow for Latin America and the global economy, Mexico's former ambassador to China, the UK, and deputy foreign secretary, and Dr. Comfort Ero. So it's been a really phenomenal day at the Chicago Council. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a few other people who've come through. It's been an extraordinary week. I have to mention one other really extraordinary thing about this week. Andy Zemanides, who is one of our trustees, hosted a tremendous conference in Washington on allies or not allies, and invited the Chicago Council to co-chair a dinner with the Greek Minister of Defense. So it's really been a phenomenal week, and talk about the best of the best in class. To top it off tonight, Dr. Comfort Ero, President and CEO of International Crisis Group, since December 24th, 2021. And we're here to talk about the annual report that Crisis Group releases every year, 10 Conflicts to Watch, which I had a look at and was released on December 31st of last year. I mean, there's something about not giving your staff a break. December 24th, you take the helm. December 31st, I mean, what were you doing through Christmas, holidays? It's really an extraordinary pace.
It's in the name. Crisis.
It's in the name. Comfort Ero has been working for Crisis Group for the better part of a couple of decades. You started in 2001. You had a couple of years break to go to the International Center for Transitional Justice, and then came back. You've been dedicated to questions of Africa, conflict, human rights, development, insofar as it's sort of a critical aspect of conflict for your entire career. You're British, based in London, and has recently received a very important honor from His Majesty the King, CMG. So that is no small achievement, and it's a recognition of the work of Crisis Group and of your leadership. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's really an extraordinary accomplishment and recognition at a very challenging moment in time when, as we know, the number of conflicts globally has risen, and also those that we, I guess, talk about the most on the global stage, for better or for worse. Sudan less than we should. Gaza, Ukraine are not resolved and have been going on for a very long time, and you know a huge amount about these conflicts. I want to ask you a question, though, for our audience here in Chicago, and we will have many people watching online, and people tend to watch back, too.
Okay.
So it sort of amplifies over time, just so you know. But not everybody here will be as familiar with the work of Crisis Group. And we had a wonderful introduction from you, Doug. But maybe you could say just a few words, also because we always have young people that pay attention and are ambitious in the best of possible ways for where they can have an impact in the world of global affairs. Could you maybe situate it? And I have a very specific question on this, which is that when I first came across the work of Crisis Group, I thought it was, it occupies a very interesting space, packed with really extraordinary experts in all the regions of the world. So expert-based, you might think tank, convenes meetings, private meetings everywhere that one would wish to on the global stage, Davos, Doha Forum, Munich, Raisina Dialogue, and so on and so forth, with highest level people at the policy level and experts. But you're not neutral. And this is the question that maybe you could sort of help the audience explain. Are you an advocacy organization? Are you just purely analytical? Because a lot of organizations are sort of, think tanks. They have individuals with institutional positions, but they don't, as an institution, take a position. But I think Crisis Group is unique in an important way, which is that you do have things that you're working to achieve. Maybe you could just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's really nice to finally be here and to also be on stage with my good friend, Leslie. She said I should come in the summer.
I did. I said it many times, and it didn't work.
Come in the summer. I said, but the 10 conflicts was always at the start of the year. So, but I will take up you on that advice next time as well. Although, as I was saying to Doug, the cold is also good for the soul as well. So, we're in our 31st year. We just marked our 30th anniversary in Sarajevo, because we were founded by transatlantic statesmen and one person close to us, Lord Macmillan Brown as well. So two US Congressional and Foreign Affairs, Morta Abramovich, who died a few years ago, and Stephen Solaris, they at the height of the conflict in Sarajevo, a year after the genocide in Rwanda, and also, after the end of apartheid South Africa, they said we've got to be better. We've got to position countries in a better position to make sure they're armed with the right information, the right analysis, so there's no longer an excuse as to why you don't act in time. So that was the intention, that you create this organization, you flood all the countries with the right analysts, experts of the country, increasingly of the region, with the sole understanding of making sure that they provide rigorous analysis. But it wasn't just writing for the sake of writing, it was writing for a purpose. And that purpose was to shift the policy dial. And we were, the mandate of the organization, or the methodology of the organization, very much started with Gareth Evans, the former foreign minister for Australia, who brought me into Crisis Group, said it's your job is to find the political will. Your job is to create the political will to enable leaders to not shy behind this notion that there's no way out of a conundrum as well. So you said we're not neutral. we have one single focus, which is human, to end the human suffering, to stop the fighting. So that's the side that we take. But we talk to all sides. And so when you read a crisis group report, you will see your views reflected in that report. We would have, crafted the report in a way that tries to expose the dilemmas, the reasons, the factors that are driving a particular conflict. I always say you may not like the conclusions because we're asking you to make compromises, but it is an impartial report in that regard, in making sure that we're objective as well and independent and our integrity is at stake otherwise. But it is an organisation that has a very straightforward mandate, which is to sound the alarm. We're based on the ground in all the countries affected, either in the country or in the region. We don't parachute in. So we are in the story ourselves. And there's a lot of, policy drives our work. And then you talked about the advocacy, and it's pretty high level advocacy. The reporting, our publication, what we write is a ticket into the room. And once we're in the room, then it's a whole different set of conversations as well. And I tell people that, we can never put everything on paper for obvious reasons, and that 80% of our knowledge is never on paper. But once you're in the room, it's a whole different ballgame because there you're really tackling the nuts and bolts of a crisis as well.
So the other thing I wanted to just kind of put on the table before we go into the report, the advocacy question is interesting too. And it's something that really struck me early on because in the domain of sort of human rights conflict, some of the big players alongside Crisis Group are Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, but you're very different from those two. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my interpretation is that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have very clear red lines on very certain things about human rights. Human rights comes first, and that Crisis Group is much more pragmatic. And it really jumped out off the page to me around 2011 and the Libya intervention when I think it was over the question of amnesty.
Oh, yeah.
So am I right? That is a much more pragmatic organization.
Yeah, it's pragmatic. It's highly political. We do get our boots dirty. We operate in the grey area, but it's complementary. There's certain things that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty are best placed to tackle, and there are other things that Crisis Group are best placed to tackle as well. But it is a highly political enterprise that we're engaged in. We are trying to carefully thread the needle. Our job is to find the pathways to peace. We're highly pragmatic, but it's also, we've got to be careful also because we're trying to understand each side in the conflict and then trying to nudge them into a particular direction. So we're not a name and shame organization, but there comes a moment in a conflict where it's increasingly intractable, where it's completely deadlocked, there's no way, and then you call a shame on the world. And it can be at any given conflict as well. So we do have those core principles at the back of our mind, but the politics of it all is what we are. That's the intersection where we engaged. And it causes us problems because we put on the table things that others wouldn't put on the table. But that's because you're dealing with the world as it is and not as the world as you'd like it. There's a world we aspire to, but our business is to find a way out of the crisis as well.
So you have this hallmark report, 10 conflicts to watch. And it must be quite difficult in today's world to winnow it down to only 10. It's a terribly sad thing to say.
Yeah.
But it isn't easy. Let's talk about sort of some of the headlines, but some of the conflicts, and then maybe we'll get to the why these and why not others.
Okay.
But I think it's such a serious set of issues and wars. Although you say conflict, which is interesting.
Yeah, wars, conflict, violence. For us, I think the issue is when you see a breakdown, and the indicators can range from sectarianism to insurgency to rebellion to. And they vary. And I should say also that Crisis Group doesn't deal with every single conflict you see in the world, it is about the deadliest violent conflict. We have our own metrics, because somebody may challenge you to say, well, why are you not working in one country as opposed to another as well? But it varies. But we shape our own criteria, and because there are others also who are better placed to do certain things that we don't. We're pretty clear about our mandate on that issue.
So maybe we could start with Sudan. How many years has it been in your report? Do you know?
Oof, that's a good question. I mean, I
At
think
least
it's
2 or
one of-
3.
Yeah, it's one of those conflicts, sadly, and to underline what you're saying, that there is no shortage of conflicts that we can put onto the list. And in an era where wars are rising, the figures vary from 54 to 60. And we're not the ones who come up with these numbers. Others come up with these numbers. But Sudan has been on the list for several years now.
So I guess one of the, big questions that I have, and maybe you can answer it through the lens of Sudan, which is that there is the sense that globally, our multilateral institutions, our leading powerful countries, not only the United States, but others, are not kind of meeting the moment.
Yeah.
And maybe we have, there's always a question of what's your baseline, when was the point when the moment was being met, but maybe we just cut into where we are now. When you analyze in Crisis Group analyzes Sudan in the report, I mean, what are you seeing? Is it really, is it as dark as it appears to be, which is just, by which I mean no resolution in sight and no really adequate global, multilateral, or even, U.S. or other response? Who are the major players and what is being done? How do you look at this conflict?
It's worth backing up a bit to recognize the country in which we're holding this conversation. About 20, 25 years ago, the US was, at the forefront of the Sudan crisis, particularly because of Omar al-Bashir's own role and using Sudan as a base for al-Qaeda. But more importantly, there was the whole Save Darfur campaign, which was driven here through the campuses, through churches, and there was a great activism by a number of US personalities, the Clooney's, and such like, who really drove through and put Darfur on the map, and were pretty clear about the horror show that was going on there. And the US was always at the center with the UK in the United Nations Security Council, pen holder, and making it sure that there had to be a resolution on Sudan. And more tragically, I mean, you mentioned Sudan, but its neighboring country, South Sudan today, which got its independence in 2011. The US was also instrumental in midwifing this. So it's always been an active player. The US is not an active player in the way it was today. And I think that speaks to your issue about who are the lead nations now today who are instrumental or who are key to unlocking the problem. And so you've got a whole host of different actors, but primarily the Gulf countries. So the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Egypt are the three, plus the US. And they have, the conundrum for Sudan is that without these actors, it's already going to be difficult to find a through line to end the conflict. But then you lay it on with all these external interests, competing interests, colluding with one another, and Sudan becomes the proxy. Sudan becomes a stomping ground where you're trying to wrestle and tussle over the interest and views of these various countries. And they all have different views of what stability looks like in Sudan. They all have different stakes involved, and it then becomes very difficult to find a through line. But we're pretty clear that external actors may be part of the problem, but they're also part of the solution, that the key to unlocking the problem in Sudan also rests with them, which is why we've been very clear that any resolution to South Sudan does require us to bring these countries to the table, and they call themselves the Quad. Anyway, which includes the US, and we've also said that the US is also key. President Trump can talk to the UAE, can talk to Saudis as well, and can talk to Egypt. But they've all decided to take a side, either with the Sudanese armed forces or with the rapid support forces. What's interesting about these two forces is that both of these forces were used by the UAE and Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen as ground forces. But they have also sort of broken apart. They were also instrumental in ousting Omar al-Bashir in the 2019 revolution. But it was also very clear that so long as you didn't deal with the issue of the integration of the rapid support force, the paramilitary force, which was supposed to be the coup-proofer for Omar al-Bashir, so long as you didn't deal with the question of how you integrate them into the security sector, so long as you had this competition between the army and the paramilitary forces, that you are never going to be able to resolve the conflict in Sudan. And one tragic another point, Leslie, is that so long as you left the peace dividend of solving Sudan's problems in the hands of civilians that didn't have the most important levers of the state, i.e. access to money, that there was no way that they were going to be able to wrestle control from the security sector. And thirdly, so long as the United States and others did not remove the most important levers that was constraining the civilians, the state sponsors terrorism, that was also going to make life difficult for civilians. So you have all this constellation of issues that made it impossible to turn that important moment of 2019 into a more sustainable transition, and that's why we're here today in Sudan.
And we have, the kind of global overlay at the time is heading into the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so a world that is turning inwards country by country. And then the so-called poly crisis that Adam Tooze has talked about that we are aware of. The U.S. very internally focused, but then within a couple of years, it is a long time for conflict to continue, but within a couple of years, the illegal invasion by Russia of Ukraine, and then on the back of that, the attacks on Israel and the war in Gaza. So, it's a terrible word to use, but massive source of distraction for the United States and for the rest of the world at a time when Sudan needed, presumably, concerted focus multilaterally and by the great powers if anything was going to be delivered in the way of peace. Just to give, before we sort of talk more about the U.S., a scope of the scale, millions of people displaced.
In Sudan? Yeah. Schools shut down, millions of children displaced, humanitarian access difficult, negotiating your way through to get basic services. Everybody works on the assumption that, starvation or weaponization of food, started in somewhere like Gaza. You see the weaponization, starvation of children in Sudan, famine. Also, in 2017, the Secretary General announced 5 countries were on the cusp of famine. Those 5 countries are still the same 5 countries today, and so it's quite an indictment also. And it's interesting that you pointed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then the Hamas's own attacks on Israel. The same set of actors are also somehow involved in Sudan. So Russia has always been interested in the Red Sea, in the port parts of Sudan, and Port Sudan, for example. UAE, we've talked about. Israel too has always had an interest in the Horn of Africa. So it is, they're all interlocked in one way. They're not all separate. And if you look, there's a through line between all of them. There's concern about Iran's interest in Sudan. There's concern that somehow, you're seeing the return of piracy in Somalia that's connected to Yemen. So we can't disconnect all of these conflicts together. They're all interlocked in different ways.
So since we're in the U.S., to return to kind of the U.S. As a positive, negative, or factor, or in multiple conflicts that you've looked at in the report, or as sort of out of commission, out of action. I mean, do you see? I guess to kind of look at Russia and Ukraine, because it has taken a lot of energy in the U.S. political context across the West, and certainly in Europe.
Yeah, I think, look, the bandwidth issue has always been there. I think what is remarkably different this time is that the countries that we would usually turn to be the conflict resolution actors, to be the peacemakers, they're all themselves facing some kind of domestic upheaval. And that's where the bandwidth issue then becomes, or that's where I think even the citizens are questioning, what is our interest in these conflicts that are far away from us? Now, we have a poverty problem at home. We have a cost of living crisis at home. We have an affordability crisis. We have children who are starving at home. So for every dollar you put overseas, there's a cost back at home as well. That is the argument that those who and I wouldn't necessarily. You don't need to be a restrainer or an isolationist to recognise that there's a domestic crisis taking place in your home. But those who want to sort of pull back the activity of the US, for example, overseas, often remind you about the domestic crises at home, or often remind you, this is our far away places, this is of no consequence to us, and therefore, and also there's the fatigue problem. Oh, we're doing Sudan again. Oh, we're doing South Sudan again. Oh, we're doing Myanmar again. Oh, we're doing Haiti again. The problem is that if you do not put in place the pillars that guarantee that you don't come back again, that's a lesson we've learned from a number of places, then you're always going to come back to the Sudans or the Haitis or even Gaza, as we're watching now as well. So, and I think the other challenge also is that the trust deficit of a lot of institutions. So you talked about multilateralism, the UN, which is the overall sort of multilateral body for peace and security, is facing a crisis of relevance. Is facing a crisis of legitimacy. It is not the first point of call anymore in the way it used to be. But the UN also, you see that in other multilateral institutions, whether it's the African Union, whether it's the regional body in West Africa. ASEAN tried for a little while. Blink, they were there in Myanmar, but Blink again, they weren't there. And the European Union is so absorbed with Ukraine that it used to be the champion, the leading actor on conflict prevention, but is very absorbed by Ukraine and the challenge of burden shifting now, that it barely has the bandwidth, and then you have the capacity issue, which is a whole another problem.
There is this feeling, and I think to Europeans' credit, I think they are self-aware. But I think the rest of us are aware too that Europe, it feels like in much of the rest of the world, apart from the question of Ukraine, that Europe is missing in action. Maybe that's not fair to say, but I want to ask you the question about.
Well, I would say it's facing an existential crisis, and I think I think you mentioned Sudan as a place where it was engaged before, but I think they're also having to adapt to certain realities. We all saw one of those realities at the start of the year, i.e. Greenland, we can name it as well. But they're also having to reckon with a United States that it's not that it's coming up with a new set of demands, i.e. the burden shifting argument, that's not President Trump's original idea, but his own position on it is a little bit more definitive than his predecessors, And there's a sense also, as you saw in the national security strategy, that it's a cultural war, and that Europe does come in for an exceptional degree of annoyance, frustration, irritation by this administration. And so I think a number of European leaders have been quite taken aback by that. They didn't necessarily believe it. I think you and I were both at Munich when the now Vice President spoke before he became Vice President.
2 years
the year
ago.
before,
Yes.
yeah. And you heard the whispers on the corridors. Europeans didn't take it seriously. They didn't believe it. And so they've now gone through the 7 stages of grief. They're still going through the 7 stages of grief. Now, at what point do you accept that this is the reality now? And I think a number of them, as a result of Greenland, have understood that this is real as well.
I mean, I think, a comment on that, it feels like clearly the perception that President Trump has it in for Europe is very strong, and I think there's many grounds for Europe feeling that way. But I think that there was a sense amongst many people, you and I have both been at the Raisina dialogue too, before President Trump was elected, where there was a feeling that Europe was missing in action, and that the Indians would say, "Look, you want us to kind of stand with you on Ukraine, but this is your war. This is your backyard. We, the rest of the world, have dealt with many, many wars. And where have you been? Europe. Europe, step up." So I guess I want to ask you the question, which is, we'll talk more about President Trump. We're here in the United States. It's an important time to have that conversation with people who are not based in the United States. But before we do, one of the ways that people, one of the places that people have looked to are other actors. Who else can, if the United States is not going to do it in conventional ways, and certainly not in resource ways, if Europe is sort of turning inwards, who are the new mediators? Who are the new negotiators? We were at the Doha Forum. Qatar is clearly positioning itself as a possible, mediator, a different kind of mediator, a different kind of negotiator. Norway has played this role. When you go through these conflicts and you sort of look, Venezuela, Gaza, Iran, Syria, Ukraine, Sudan, do you see these middle powers, these other countries as having a meaningfully positive role to play in trying to deliver peace?
Yeah, positive, negative. The point is that the regions matter. The point is that there's always an anchor country. There's always a balancer in any conflict that is crucial. So whenever you read a crisis group's report, the default position is not the United States or even Europe. It is about trying to think through who has the levers, who has the leverage, and a particular time. So let's pick a particular conflict in Myanmar. We've always said that the key to this was going to be China, but increasingly, because of the refugee flows, because of the pressure on the region, India too was important. Bangladesh, I was in the Cox's Bazar, and number one, I did not appreciate that was the largest refugee camp. I always assumed that it was the one in Kenya, who was hosting a number of refugees from Somalia. So it's a real wake-up call to see that. And then you see the proximity to the border, you see the movement of refugees, armed militias, and you see the pressure on Bangladesh immediately. So Bangladesh has to think of a way in which to negotiate and work with the authorities, not just in the bordering neighbouring state, but also then with the central authorities. And then China has a scam center problem, and so you have to negotiate with China. And then you've got the Security Council, and then you've got Russia, because Russia has a very good relationship with the junta. So America was not in this story at all, if, for example. But then you get the surprise, the big surprise for us was in the Great Lakes, where we always thought that this was the African Union, the region, and Europe, and suddenly the US is now a leading actor with the state of Qatar, as you mentioned, in negotiating both the tensions between Kinshasa and Kigali, and the UA. They've worked out a division of labor where President Trump has come in off the back of the request of Qatar to help mediate this tension between the two countries on the border with the DRC and Rwanda. And meanwhile, Qatar deals with the M23 rebel group, mediating with them in Qatar. So that's division of labor. It's not a beauty contest. There are certain countries that bring political muscle to a particular conflict. There are certain countries that bring a humanitarian muscle to the conflict, and there are others who bring, certain different mechanics, financial and what have you as well. And it's about how you weave them to the table. The key for me is that we don't want to get to a situation where you exclude particular countries from the table, especially if they are spoiling the conflict. But we need you to be at the table, because if you're not at the table, then you become, you become the blocker to the process. So when you look at any of those reports, Syria is another good example. This wasn't mediated by the United Nations, for example. It was led by the region, and the head boy in this story was partly Turkey, but you had Qatar and you had Saudi Arabia. So it is a different set of actors, whether you call them middle. Some of these countries that we call middle powers may not like to be called middle powers as well. We discussed
We did
that
talk about this at lunch.
over lunchtime. So sometimes I just call them non-Western actors. They've always been there, by the way, because this is their neighborhood. This is their region. But now they've taken on a different weight because they're no longer influential in their own region, but they're also influential way beyond their region. So you'll see Qatar, for example, playing a role in the Latin America region, playing a role vis-a-vis Bangladesh, playing a role vis-a-vis Afghanistan, Pakistan, for example.
So the report comments very interestingly on President Trump.
You need to explain why you think it's interesting.
But it does say that the unorthodoxy, that there are times, there have been examples where the unorthodoxy of President Trump actually has utility in unlocking situations. There is sort of a question about where that then leads. You use the example of Syria. Being willing to engage with the new Syrian leader who was still labeled a terrorist, then very quickly lifting the sanctions, which we saw coming at the Doha Forum. We were at Doha together, and Christiane Amanpour chaired, was it the president? And she started out by saying, you were a terrorist, weren't you a terrorist? Only Christiane Amanpour can kind of say it in this. My jaw sort of dropped, and and the conversation continued. But they did at that point. We were waiting. There was an anticipation that the U.S. would lift the sanctions. I will say, I can't say who, but earlier this week in Washington, we heard a very powerful critique of that choice. But maybe you could follow through this thought that's in the report, that there is something about the unorthodoxy.
We also said it was iconoclastic as well. Look,
well, explain this in a way that's,
quite frankly, there's certain things that was interesting about President Trump. No other president in the United States would have had the audacity to meet al-Shara, who still had a mushroom of sanctions upon him, would have decreed that his officials meet Hamas, if you rewind, the Biden administration would have been criticized heavily for daring to do this as well. But, there is something, untethered about President Trump that allows him to play that, which is why we say he's unorthodox, he's iconoclastic. He's brought an energy to a space that was just muddling through, that we labeled, consecutively 2023, 2024, as we're going through an era of a crisis of peacemaking. We haven't seen any significant comprehensive peace deals like we'd seen in the 1990s or early 2000s. Gone are the days of the comprehensive peace deals like Colombia or the Philippines or such like processes as well. So suddenly you had this president who wanted the legacy and declared himself as a president for peace as well. But, and then, whether it's 8 conflicts is resolved or 9 or 11, we've lost count of what he's actually done. But the key issue is that, he labeled himself as a deal maker. And to be fair to President Trump, he has delivered some truces. And those truces, for an organization that is very focused on how do you stop the fighting first, before you get to the hard task of the politics of that peace, stopping the fighting, to get the humanitarian aid in, that for us is an important, and one should give him credit where credit is due as well. So, credit him for, the good start at the time of his inauguration, working with the outgoing Biden administration to get the peace deal. But then, the green lighting, reinforcing the excesses of Israel then meant that sort of got thrown out of the window. And then fast forward to the Gaza Sharm el-Sheikh summit. And, I'm sure you'll ask me about the Board of Peace, but nonetheless, we've gone from phase 1, where a number of people had question marks that would get from phase 1, from getting the releases of all the hostages, and unfortunately those that had passed away, trying then to open the border and get the food and the aid into Gaza, to now the most complicated part of that. This wouldn't happen without President Trump and the pressure he's putting on Israel, but also on Hamas as well. And in the same also, look, we were surprised about the Armenia Azerbaijan peace corridor. It's now called the Trump Train for Peace as well. We were surprised also by the India-Pakistan. It's not over yet, but nonetheless, we were surprised that he was able to weigh into that. We were surprised that he was able to weigh into Cambodia, Thailand. So he comes with an outsized energy to the process. The challenge, however, is how you convert all these short-term truces, all these ceasefires into credible long-term process. And what is lacking is the patient capital that you need, the delicate weaving, holding hands, pressure points, and the tendency to get distracted, to go off to the next thing, and not to have in place, those classical diplomats who know the lay of the land, and everything is crucial. Having said that, what is happening in Syria right now, very focused, insightful process, is also down to one of these unorthodox ambassadors, envoys that Trump has put into his orbit as well.
I'm going to come to the audience after just one more question, so please do be ready. There's a lot in the report, but there's a lot in your experience far beyond the report as well. And I guess it is, the conflict that probably most people in the United States have been focused on, of those that have come through your report, and that would be Ukraine. I guess, there's one thing to acknowledge too, and you acknowledge it all the time implicitly, but just to kind of put it out there, these are not easy things for anybody to have a meaningful influence on.
Yeah.
So, it's sort of an unfair measure for any president, for any country, to be able to, to deliver a lasting peace in Sudan, between Israel and Palestine, in Gaza, in Ukraine, to kind of put Russia in its proper sovereign place and not in others' sovereign place. I mean, these are incredibly difficult.
Yeah, but this is why you shouldn't say that within 24 hours of my arrival in power, I'm going to solve this conflict.
Yeah.
Right. For all the praise I'll give to President Trump, it's also, it's a lack of understanding of the complexities of, what drove Putin to do this, but also what is at stake for Ukraine. And it's one of the interesting things about him is that he's actually admitted that this was the one I thought was going to be easiest. Why would you think that? If you understood the fundamentals of what, look what's happening today. We have, to be fair, gotten the prisoner swap, and that, for 5 months, that was, we hadn't seen that for 5 months. So that's significant. But, everybody comes out of the room thinking that they've got a deal, and then you get a different message in the Kremlin, which is, well, actually, no, that's not what we agreed. Actually, what we want is a comprehensive deal. Things get lost in translation.
So let me ask you one very pointed question, and then we'll open it up about Trump's approach, President Trump's approach to Russia and Ukraine and Europe in the context of the war in Ukraine. Do you, in your analysis, yours, Crisis Group, do you think that his unorthodox, iconoclastic approach to Vladimir Putin, to President Zelensky, to Europe in all its component parts, but also collectively, has made the war in Ukraine better or worse, or more likely to land a lasting peace, or less likely?
It's hard to tell. What was key to us, and what we said in last year's 10 conflicts to watch in anticipation of President Trump's arrival, is that we said that even if the negotiations, or even if the first phone call that was made was to President Putin, that's not a bad issue. It is unusual to find your ally in the middle negotiating between the two of you. At least Europe is working on the assumption that the US is still an ally. So that's an odd day. But nonetheless, there are talks happening, and that's an important step. The dilemma, however, that even Trump has had to admit last week was that he asked Putin to stop fighting. The Russians turned around and clarified and said, no, we're not bombing in Kyiv, but the others are still on the table as well. But I think it's exposed also maybe the weaker side of the president as well, which is also that this is a long, ongoing, complicated conflict, and Putin has been very clear about his demands, and those haven't changed at all. He wants a pliant Ukraine. He's now made it clear that he wants the Donbass. They are winning on the battlefield, but the politics is now where the real obstacles are. Zelensky's already said we'll concede on NATO. But the security guarantees, our position, Leslie, is pretty clear on this, is that the clearest security guarantee for Ukraine is a strong Ukrainian army. And nothing can exceed that. It needs to have its own territorial integrity and sovereignty at stake. And the only way you can guarantee that is with a strong force. But we have another dilemma, which is how the relationship between Europe and the US, at least under this administration, is a very different one. I talked about the cultural war, but I also mentioned, and it's in the national security strategy, no other country gets the same, or no other region gets the same terse, frustrated, angry reaction than Europe as well. And, they want to, there's a sense in which they're not satisfied with the politics of each country, so they want to bend it towards the right, further right. They made it very clear. Vance's speech last year was pretty clear that they were not happy with the politics. They were talking about freedom of speech. Well, freedom of speech, according to the politics that you ascribe to, is what we also heard as well. And nobody will argue against the need to burden shift. There's a sense in which Europe had woken up from, how many years of sort of reliance on the US umbrella. as well. But it's more than security. It seems that it's heavily cultural, and it's heavily tilted to the kind of politics that they want to see from Europe. So it's a tsunami of problems that Europe finds itself having to tussle with. Short of asking itself whether today its ally is now an adversary. I mean, a number of European countries don't want to say that for obvious reasons. But one of the messages that they took away from Greenland was that they now look at the US in a very different light, because it was a shocking reality check for them that this is a very different relationship today.
Okay, I think that's pretty clear, and I think it's important. And thank you for sharing your thinking on this. Let's come right to the audience. Hands high, and Anastasia is going to help me work out. Right here in the front. Oh, please, and then one in the front row here.
Hi, I'm Deirdre. I'm with the Gages. Deirdre Joyce Smith. Thank you, Dr. Ero, and congratulations on your distinction. I wanted to ask, and given the conflicts here in 2026, how should we be incorporating changes in the global economy with conflict and risk?
Oh, that's...
Let's take two. We'll take two, because you can mull that one over. It's a big question.
Yeah.
We have one here in the front row, I think. Yes.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive and depressing.
Sorry.
So my name is Zahir Sahloul. I'm a Syrian American physician in Chicago and also the president of MedGlobal, which is an NGO that provides healthcare in disaster areas. So we work in Gaza, in Syria, in Ukraine, in Bangladesh, and Sudan. Actually, I came 2 weeks ago from Sudan. I have two questions. One of them is about the conflicts themselves. You've mentioned there's 55 to 60 conflicts. And we're seeing actors who did not used to be part of the conflicts, like UAE and others, and now they are parties to conflicts. What is the reason for that? People question what is the intention or the motive for small countries to be part of conflicts. We understand geopolitics and control of access and natural resources and things like that. But are there any other reasons that we do not know? Regarding Syria, you expanded on Syria. Last year, we were guests when the change of the previous regime to the current government happened in Syria, me and my wife. We talked about how hopeful we were, and the fact that actually that was a miracle, was not done by any crisis group or United Nations or the role of the US or Europe. Just happened. Turkey, I think, was the main factor in this. And now we're in different reality. There's a huge problems in Syria still right now. Usually after a long crisis, you have international group and international community having a conference for rebuilding the countries. That did not happen in Syria. The World Bank estimated $250 billion to be rebuild Syria. So people can come back and refugees can come back, which is a major issue. So why is this not happening to stabilize the situation and have stability in the whole region, which looks like all actors want to have stability? Thank you very much.
I think there's a link between your last point and what was just and the question that you asked. I think what's interesting about Syria is that the region itself has become the economic incubator, and the investment is coming very strongly from Saudi Arabia, particularly, and Qatar as well. But you're right. I assume you mean that you want to see that usual international conference on Syria, and one of the things that we said and we saw it, in fact, with the number of countries that have gone to Syria and now bringing their diplomats back into Syria. So the EU, individual member states of the European Union, the Middle East countries, the President Trump himself, bringing al-Sharia out of the cold in Riyadh. These have fed into the process of at least building some kind of international confidence about Syria as well. And the key is making sure lessons learned from Afghanistan. The key is to make sure that, number one, there's a full lifting of those sanctions. Because if you don't lift those sanctions, then you don't get the confidence to allow investment into the country. And that's just the simple answer to that question. And I think it ties in with the political economy of every conflict. We were talking over lunch that, however, we've got two new variables that we need to think about now, which is trade and tariffs. I never thought you could deploy trade and tariffs as a lever to get a peace process going, but there you have it, or to use it as an instrument to punish a country for any misdemeanors that you think that it's performed. So that's quite interesting. So I'll stop. Your more pertinent question. You sort of answered it yourself, because those are real factors, by the way. The geopolitics. I would also directly say to that the balance of power. Some of the countries that are also involved in Sudan and elsewhere, it's also about balancing powers and interests also. But it's also about their own definition of what stability looks like in Sudan. And when you ask, for example, you ask a country like the UAE, why are you engaged in Sudan, and what would it take to get you out of Sudan? They say that from a national security perspective, that they are concerned about Islamist extremism. They are concerned that the Islamists still have a strong hand in Sudan. And then you have to probe that a little bit further. You ask Egypt the same question as to why it's engaged in Sudan, and they'll tell you that they don't want to see militia Islamist groups taking power, and that they tie themselves, or they don't want to see power in the hands of this paramilitary militia forces, but they want to see it in an institution, a credible institution that they think is credible, in the form of the Sudanese armed forces. The same with Saudi Arabia. They've all been clear about that. The question is that Sudan is breaking up. It's been fragmented, and how you stop that slide is the key challenge for Sudan today.
Very good. Towards the back, do we have? Oh, yes, good. I think we can probably take two, and then we have to kind of bring it to a close.
Thank you. I'm Anne Michelle Boyle. Hi, I'm a teacher at Whitney Young. I teach these amazing students next to me.
Nice to see you.
We've been currently talking in class a lot about disinformation, misinformation. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how disinformation campaigns are impacting these 10 conflicts differently or similarly.
And then we'll take one more, right, I think in the front. Maybe these two. We'll take these three, and then we'll bring it, good. Bring it back to you to close.
Hi, my name is Allison Malton. I'm a senior at Whitney Young. And I was just wondering, earlier you said that international crisis is focused on engaging in the political sides of these crises. And can you explain how or what that looks like? Because it feels so hard to understand or conceptualize focusing on the politics when these are global superpowers.
And then a final one from the gentleman in the front. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting discussion. My question relates to, I'm Art Franczek of IBEC. Okay, my question relates to, as you know, today, the 5-year extension to the 2011 SALT Treaty expires today. Okay, and Trump has decided not to pursue renewal, ostensibly because China is not a part of it. Now, the reports in the news are that this could stimulate a further nuclear arms race. And my question is, how would you comment on that?
Thank you.
That's a good question.
Okay, so you've got a couple few wrap-ups. So whatever you'd like to say.
On this last one, I mean, if there's one thing that's that should keep us all awake at night, is that we have a crisis in the collective security architecture. There was always an understanding about arms control and non-proliferation as well. And so we are talking in the week, as you rightly said, sir, where the New START has sort of ended. But it's also interesting that, so I've been trying to figure out, I'm sure you've been figuring it out and others have been trying to figure out, what was that call that President Trump had with Xi Jinping today, and on either side of that, Xi Jinping called Putin as well. And is it trying to get an understanding, as you were implying, about a new framework? But at the same side, the news that came out today was that there was an agreement that there will still be on the sidelines of the UAE, Abu Dhabi, Ukraine talks about military-to-military dialogue between the US and Russia. And quite frankly, for an organisation that's focused on conflict prevention, we want you to dialogue. Dialogue. That's the key for us. So it's hard to tell what's going to emerge. But if the news today about a military-to-military conversations between US and Russia, if that's true, then we should recognise that as an important step as well. But I'm sure we'll find out in the coming days what the conversation was that happened between President Trump and Xi as well. In terms of I mean, I think you're asking me about how we work, and there's a lot that we do in public, but there's a lot that we do in private. There's a lot of back channeling. Leslie, you referred to our convening of meetings, and we're not mediators. We don't do mediation. We have a view on mediation, so we can't be judge and jury, but we conceive the table. We bring different actors to the table to think through what are the possible options that would help unlock a conflict as well. What are the solutions? Because in the end, we're trying to find a pathway out. We're very solutions orientated in crisis group, and we try to. Sometimes we're ahead of the curve. Sometimes what we recommend today is it's not possible because the actors aren't there yet to make that type of decision as well. But we see our reporting, as I said at the beginning, as a ticket into the room to have that more complicated conversation about what the policy options look like beyond what we've put on the paper, and then to think through what potential solutions could look like. We're not in the sanctuary of government, so we don't know what the trades-off are that governments have to make. But our job is to help you think through of what the possible ways forward are as you make all those calculations as well. It's not linear. It's there different false starts as well. But the idea is to help decision makers and all the key conflict actors think through what the options are. And for us, it's talk. Dialogue. That for us is key. And you've got to listen to what all the key actors are saying. You've got to understand their position. And whatever assumptions that you have, leave them at the door because they're certain different variables are playing out in these conflicts as well.
It's tremendous. The work of...
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, please.
You asked me this really important question about disinformation, and I shouldn't forget that because given your students as well. Look, in the end, for crisis group, the most important thing for us is facts and verifying the facts as well. So we are, in a simple way, you can see us as fact checkers. Everything that we write, everything that the analysts write in crisis group is fact checked before we put it on paper. Our integrity is at stake otherwise. And in this age of disinformation, misinformation, everybody has his or her own truth, of fake news. You need independent fact verifiers. I think, and also having said that, it's very horrifying to me, Leslie, that the litany of journalists who have died in the last year and a half. And these are your guardians of truth at one level. So, in tribute to them, it's so important that we spend time cutting away from the news and really trying to understand what's happening. And for me, the very first step for Crisis Group is that we put the fact on the table so that you can understand what's at stake. And then we think about the next step, which is around the policy and the advocacy. But if you don't get the facts right, then you can't begin to be helpful in trying to help unlock the way out for a conflict as well.
I think we can all agree that the breadth, but also the depth, is extraordinary. It's reflective of your leadership, of the organization. If you're not familiar with the research and the analysis and the engagement of Crisis Group, I do really strongly encourage you to pay attention. It is really an absolute leader in the field globally, and you will see the people that work for the organization at every single top table across the world. And then we don't see all the things that you're doing behind the scenes. I've been privy to be at a few of your meetings, and they're special, and they're serious. They're not for show, if you know what I mean. So thank you for the work you do. Thank you for the trip to Chicago.
Thank you.
And for joining us here. It's been great.